Okay, so today we will handle controllers and routing, which is a central part of any CMS system and of Pimcore too, of course. And we tried to make use of all of Symfony's routing and controller features while not changing everything and while keeping still known Pimcore features. So as recap, the Symfony architecture is event-driven. So you start with a request, and this request travels the whole event listener chain until at the end the response is returned. So we have multiple points where we can influence this request, and the first one is the controller request event, which is the first blue box you see here. And this is where all the routing happens. So the router gets a request and tries to resolve this request into some kind of controller. So the router has a list of known routes, has documents, has static routes, and there's configuration, and tries to find something which matches this request. And from this result, a controller is resolved, and the controller can be anything which is callable. So a controller normally is a class and a function, an action function, but could be virtually anything which can handle a request. And at the end of this chain, the response, so there's another event, is the controller event, the second blue box, where the controller is actually called. And then this called controller event happens. And the third one is the response event, which happens after the controller was called. So potential event handlers can still influence the response before it is returned to the browser. Okay. The standard Symfony router is one router which can be configured in many ways. And we had an additional need, which is dynamic routes. So anything stored in the database or in not Symfony config files. So this is mainly our documents and our static routes, which work a little bit different than the Symfony ones. So they are still available. And to achieve this, there's the Symfony CMF project, which is the content management framework project, which is a set of reusable components to build content management systems. And one of these components is the chain router, which allows us to hook multiple router instances into this routing process. So there's the standard Symfony router, which is configured with configuration files or controller annotations, or by injecting PHP routes directly via code. And then additionally, there's the dynamic routing, which takes place at the routing level and does database lookups and tries to resolve routes dynamically. Because if you have a lot of documents, you don't want to preload all of them for every request, but you want to just look dynamically what is there. So find the route by path and try to resolve just one document for that. And the fourth one is the Pimcore static routes, as you know them from Pimcore 4. They're still available because they're a little bit different than the Symfony routes. For example, with the site support, which treats routes differently depending on which site you are. So for example, you could have a news route, which is defined multiple times and depends on the current site. And this is currently not possible with the standard Symfony routing, so we kept this static routes for now. One addition which we added in Pimcore to the standard Symfony configuration is that bundles can define a routing config which is automatically loaded. So third-party Pimcore bundles can define a routing YML in this defined location here, and resources config Pimcore routing, and this file is automatically loaded. Symfony doesn't do this by default because they want to leave all the control to the developer. But for Pimcore bundles, this makes sense as they hook into a already working system, and contrary to Symfony, which is a framework. So you can have a search bundle, for example, which exposes some standard search routes, and these can be automatically configured by your bundle. So as soon as this bundle is activated, the routes will be available. Okay, so here's a short overview of this chain and dynamic router. Routing also is responsible for generating routes through the router. So, for example, you have a news route and you want to get an URL for that. That's also done through the router. And all kinds of routing, so the dynamic Pimcore routing and the standard Symfony routing can all be generated through the same router. So if you have a news route which is defined via Symfony configuration, it is generated the same way as a news route which is defined through Pimcore static routes. So on this slide, you have a couple of examples how this can be called. Basically, you have always the router instance and can call the generate method on that. And here we see a couple of variations. So the router directly has a generate method. The standard controller has a generate URL method, and view helpers typically expose a path and URL method or methods, which either generate a relative path or an absolute URL. Okay, so much for the routing part. And now let's have a look at controllers. So given we have the routing result and we know which controller we want to call, the router records on the request that a certain callable should be called as controller. So as I said before, this can be a class or an action of a class or a method, a class method, or just a plain function. So if you have micro frameworks like Silex, for example, they use the same controller system as Symfony, and they're just anonymous functions. A controller receives a request and is expected to return a response object. So typically you get the request object, read some parameters and return a response object. So this can be a JSON response or a plain HTML response, as we saw in the last templating webinar, with an exception that there's the template annotation or the template auto rendering, which you saw last time. And this reacts on a controller not returning a response and automatically injects a render template. But besides of that, all controllers need to return a response. Controllers can be registered as a service on the service container to make full use of dependency injection. There were a lot of improvements in Symfony 3.3, which we use since end of May. And you can register controllers as service. You can inject any services you need into your controllers. So the controller isn't in charge of fetching any services from somewhere, but when the controller is built, you have a fully working instance. So you can build more decoupled controllers. You don't have to depend on any base classes. You can, for example, inject a specialized logger for your shop controllers, or you can do any kinds of service dependency injection, the things you need. Request specific values, so stuff which depends on the request, can be used as action arguments. So for example, we have seen this on the request object, which you can use on any controller action, but we added some more parameters you can use. For example, you can always get the current document via the document parameter, or the view model, which is the view parameters. This also includes the document, or the edit mode. So you don't need to rely on the this document property, which we added as compatibility or as known feature from Pimcore 4, but you can always request a document via an argument. Important is to note that this has to be noted exactly like it is here. So you have to type hint on the document class, and the parameter needs to be named document, because otherwise the system can't find or can't resolve what you need. And although there's no mandatory base class, as I said before, we built a front-end controller which basically exposes similar properties as Pimcore 4 did. So you have a this document, you have a this view, and you have a this edit mode property available, which you can directly use, so that this eases migrations from Pimcore 4. A big difference to send controllers or Pimcore 4 controllers is that there is no init function, and there are no pre and post dispatch events which are automatically fired, because a controller can be any class, so you can't rely on these methods being available. But generally, this can easily be replaced. So anything which is initialization could either be moved on the controller constructor or outside of the controller. So you could define a service which is configured through the container, or you can build a factory for something. For example, if you build some kind of database structure, or you need to fetch some data, you can move this out of the controller. Or you just use the class constructor for the init, which is called once when the controller is built, or something like that. So you don't have to define a standard init method, but you can just build classes as you know it and build them as you need them. For pre and post dispatch, there are the kernel request and kernel response events we saw earlier. So generally, you can implement an event handler which listens on these events and does some stuff before and after controller is executed. But we added an evented controller interface, which does exactly that. So there's an event handler which looks at the controller, looks if the controller implements this interface, and then calls on kernel request before the action is executed, and on kernel response after the action is executed. So you have easy access to a replacement method for pre and post dispatch. So, okay, and as I mentioned before, we have a front-end controller which is meant to be a standard base controller you can use for all your applications. So you don't need to use this, but you can, and you have a lot of helper methods available. If you have more specialized needs, you can always build your own base controller or do whatever you need. The front controller exposes known properties as this document, this view, and this edit mode, but they are not properties on the controller. They're just automatically read from the request. So you it's just a bridge which you can use to have known behavior. So this document is never stored on the controller instance, but it's read from the request when you access this document. And it's always the same object as you get if you request a document argument from at the action level. The front-end controller also has the auto rendering, which you saw last time at the templating webinar. So you can either use the add template annotation, or you can call this enable view auto render, which also marks the request as templated request and then does all the auto rendering templating stuff. And the front-end controller implements the evented controller interface. So you can use the methods I mentioned before on the front-end controller directly. They are there and they're empty, and if you need them, you can just use them. Okay. Basically, we have a really simple installation, which has 3 different controller actions. And I'm going to show you how you can access this controller action from documents, from Pimcore static routes, from configuration, and from controller annotations. So just to get started, we have a really simple document, which is called info. And this document relies on a demo controller in the add bundle and on an info action. And if you have a look at this, this is just a really simple action which shows us the currently called controller method or controller and method, and a couple of values which we read from the request, and the current document path. So the path of the document which is returned in this document. If we have a look at this at the code side, we just have a demo controller. We have an info action, and this info action gets a logger, logs a message, and then renders just a simple info template with the attributes we just saw. So we read something from the request. So the request object is really powerful and gives you access to everything you need regarding the server globals and anything which comes with the request. There's, for example, the attributes property, which has a lot of internal attributes like the current route, and you can use this to store metadata on the request while you handle the event. sorry. And then you see some couple of other properties from the request, like the scheme, the HTTP host, and so on. And we have the document, which we read from this document and don't get it from any argument, but we just use the front-end controller and read the document via this document. And we use the thisRender method, pass a template, and pass the data. And the template is really simple, just outputs the title and dumps the data. So as we saw before, we have this action. This was accessed through a document, so the dynamic router automatically resolves document/info onto these parameters as the document defines it. This is as you know it. Second approach is to define a static root for the same thing. So we have a Pimcore static root in the known static roots table. This is called static root info, has a path and a reverse path, and defines the same controller action as before. So if you access this via static root, the output is nearly the same. So we see the root is another one. We also see the root on the web toolbar below. And we see the document is another one, because at this point we don't have any document which matches the root. So we just have this document/info root. And Pimcore tries to find the nearest document which matches the static root. So the nearest document to static root, just the /static root, is the home document. So the document is just the root document of the whole tree. Otherwise, the action is nearly the same. The third method to define a static root is by using configuration files. This is the standard Symfony routing system. So you can I've opened before, but then it was closed. So you have a powerful routing system in Symfony, and you can take a look at this documentation where it is explained really well. To define such a root, you have the routing file I mentioned before. So we have a routing YML in my bundle, in my app bundle. And this routing YML defines 3 routes. And the first one is the info route. We will have a look at the other ones in a moment. And so if I access /config/info, I get the same controller as the other 2 actions. So again, I'm on the info action just with another route. So if I open this, third one here, again, looks the same as the static root, just the root and the path are different. Document again is the root document, as there's nothing which matches config/info. And the fourth method is the annotation thing, which basically is the same as the configuration, just another way how to specify routes. So you can define all your controllers in your bundle as annotation controllers. So this means Symfony looks at the controller classes, reads class annotations, and checks if there are any root definitions on these controllers. So if you have a look at the controller again, you see there's the root annotation on the action level, and this root annotation says create a root annotation/info for this action. So internally, the routing table is written the same as from the routing YML, just in another format. So you have it. It's nearer to the action. It's a choice of it depends if you like it, but it's quite elegant sometimes. So the routing annotation also is quite powerful. So you can nest it, for example. You could also say root annotation, and all actions which are in this controller will be prefixed by annotation, and I could say this is just /info, and in the end it will be also annotation/info. So just to revert this. Okay, so the fourth method, I can also open the action. My URL is annotation/info. Info is the same, just the root and the path are different. Okay, then the same thing can be done with parameters. So as you know, static roots can match any parts of the URL into named parameters. So for example, I have a root which is called /hello/name. So for example, if I open the static root /hello/webinar, the action just returns this name in the view. So the action is really simple. Just reads the name from the request. Get iterates get, post, and the attributes parameter bags, so-called, in Symfony. So it tries to read the property from all known sources. And if it doesn't find anything, it will default to the value we pass here. So if we don't have a name, it will default to hello stranger. So if you have here hello webinar, we can change this to world and have hello world for the static root. Same thing is in the configuration file. So I have the configuration file and have a placeholder which is matched against any value here. I can also define validation rules. I could say this only matches integers, for example. So you can just build regexes here. You can say that the name has some kinds of requirements. So the same thing works for the configuration file entry. And the third one is the annotation one. Also works the same. You have the parameter here, and you have a format where you can define any additional root requirements. So you can also say, I need a special host name, or need a special, I just want to do this on SSL, for example. And the annotation one works the same as the other two. I include the document as last one because the document also has this controller action set as the other three, but we don't have any parameter matching here. So if I open the document, I could pass the name as get parameter, and this works the same. I don't have anything, it just returns the strange as we saw before. So here the handling is a little bit different, but as the request get iterates all parameter sources, it also works for documents. Okay, so much for this path. And the other controller I still have is the part with the controller services. So, as I mentioned before, you can define controllers as services. Instead of extending the frontend controller, you can just define a class which doesn't extend from anything, doesn't have a get method to get container services, doesn't have a render method to automatically render templates. And now we have a look how this can be used to build quite slim controllers. So we have a service controller, which has also an info action. I call it just request info to distinguish it from the other two. And this controller does not extend any frontend controller. Instead, it just is a plain class which implements the evented controller interface we saw before. And the controller defines a property, a logger property, which is a mandatory argument to its constructor. So if this controller is built, the building service needs to know that this controller needs a logger, and the controller can't be built without a logger. And in the action, we use the logger we injected before to log, hey, we're doing anything, we're doing something. And we use the on-kernel controller and on-kernel response events I mentioned before to also output some logging. So we see what happens. So when which log message is recorded. To get this working, the system needs to know how the controller is built and how it is referenced. So to use this in the system, you need to define your controller as service. This is done by default since Symfony 3.3, and we added this to the standard install profiles as well. So if you install a new Pimcore installation now, your empty or your demo CMS app profiles will also include the service definitions, which has a wildcard definitions for all controllers. I added the controller here as full service, not with wildcards, just to see it just in this demo service controller, not on the other one. So we see our controller is named the same as the class name. This is a new naming convention from Symfony 3.3. So they use the class name for the service definition normally. Class is the class we just saw. You get a logger, which is the generic logger from the framework. So you get just a PSR logger interface. It is public, so the routing can resolve and load it on demand. and it has two dependency injection tags. So the tags are just metadata, which tell the container building logic what to do with the service. So one tag is the monologue logger tag, and this tells Symfony when it builds the container to inject a specialized logger. So we have the app logger, there's a doctrine logger, which just logs DB queries. There's a cache logger, which just logs cache stuff. And you can request any specialized logger by tagging the service with the monologue logger tag, and the logger injected here above is a specialized logger with this channel. You can use this channel to filter logs, to just write a specialized channel to an extra file, or to just ignore channels. So they're just a categorization of logs you can use to read the logs later. And the other tag is the controller service arguments tag, which is needed for two reasons. One is to get the controller to get the system inject any other services you might require into your action arguments. I'll show you what I mean in a second. And the other one is for Pimcore to resolve this controller as service controller. So when Pimcore builds the select for the admin interface for documents and static routes, it will read all services which are defined with this tag and add them as, or list them as controller which is defined as service. Regarding service arguments, we also render the info template here, but the controller here doesn't have any thisRender method, because the thisRender is defined on the Symfony standard controller, which is a parent of the frontend controller. But as we have a plain class here, the render method doesn't exist. So what we do here is, instead of calling thisRender, we just build a new response object and get the templating engine, which is Twig in this case, or is the delegating engine, which is able to cope with both kinds of templates. It just delegates to the Twig engine, depending on the template, and say templating render, which returns a HTML string, and we put it into the response, and this response is the whole thing we return. So instead of having a thisRender and having the engine as controller property or some injected somewhere, we just request this on the action level when we need it. And by using this controller service arguments tag, this is automatically resolved by Symfony. There's a good blog post on all these additions regarding auto wiring and auto configuration on the Symfony blog, which is quite interesting. So they added quite a lot of features in this direction. And if you have a look at this action, the output should be nearly the same as the other info action. So we have the one which is defined on the document, and we have the other three which are defined the same way as the other known actions, as I showed you before. Output is the same, it just rendered in a different way, and also here the document is empty again. A little difference is how these controllers are referenced on the controller, on the document, sorry. So on normal documents, normal controllers, you select the bundle optionally, or you default to the app bundle, and you select the controller and an action. As a controller which is defined as service doesn't necessarily have to live inside a bundle, but can be anywhere, basically. You just reference the service definition. So you add an add prefix and then the service definition as it is defined in your config file. So we defined a demo service controller in the services file, and this is what we reference here in the select. Pimcore will automatically recognize this based on the service controller arguments tags, controller service arguments, and give you this as select option. Same thing for static root. So the third root doesn't have a bundle selected, just a demo service controller with the add prefix. And as I showed you before, we added a logger. So we have the profiler toolbar, which can be used to inspect what is logged during a request. If you look at the standard info, which also logged something just in the action, we see This is logged through the standard app channel, which is the standard logging channel for all logs which are not categorized in any specialized channels. So you will see many app events throughout the system. If you have a look at the request info, we have, first of all, the log from the two event handlers. So you have the on-kernel controller and on-kernel response logs, which we added through the event handlers. And we have the normal action log, which we also had on the info action. And as you can see, the channel is the one we requested through the service. So it's the my controllers channel. And for example, you could use this channel to write a specialized my controller log file where you record something special. Okay. And with this, we're getting at the end of our demo. All of this code is available in the Pimcore webinar code samples repository in GitHub, which is publicly available. There's already the code which I showed you. I just have a couple of additions I will push shortly, so you will find a complete code sample of these actions and views. Okay, so thank you for your patience with the technical difficulties and for your interest, and see you next time.